Bueno, profe, let's talk about using more Spanish in your class. Because when I started to do this, my students were like, hold up, where did the routine go? Where are my notes? How am I learning? This is not learning. I had a student really tell me, we're not learning, we're just speaking Spanish. And that's the goal. So let's talk about it. So my students really struggled with this. They were used to structure, routines, notes, and when I started to introduce storytelling, stick around and let's talk about those results. So a quick introduction to what comprehensible input or acquisition-driven instruction is. People will use these terms to talk about teaching Spanish in Spanish. So comprehensible input means giving students input or text, visuals, videos, music, and making it comprehensible, making it something they can understand. Acquisition-driven instruction is teaching for acquisition, where you are encouraging students to acquire Spanish, to practice Spanish, and to use Spanish in your classroom. And both of these require you to use more Spanish. So if you need some help getting over, oh, my Spanish isn't good enough, check out my other video about that. When I started to use more Spanish, I was teaching at one of those no-nonsense charter schools that is super rigid and had really strict procedures. And I faced a lot of pushback from my students because, like I said, they were used to taking notes, regurgitating information, which you can't do in a language class if you want to use language. They were in that robotic learning style. I had students constantly asking, what are we doing? We're not learning, but we were learning. So I had to change their belief about what we were doing. And I realized they still needed structure, but maybe in a new way. So what I started to do was to adjust the way that I was teaching to my students. So I would preview a little bit of vocab because they still needed those notes. And then I would review that vocabulary while maintaining those comprehensible input strategies and driving towards acquisition. I would follow up my storytelling with written copies of stories, with comprehension questions, and more structured activities to help my students see that they were doing something, but also to practice those skills. Now I do things really differently, but this is just how I started. And then we would do a lot of retelling activities where students were summarizing, they were writing and drawing about what they had read or what they had heard. They were creating their own stories using the same style of stories that we were seeing in class. And then we did have weekly quizzes because that was required by my school. So we had weekly quizzes with story-based questions to reinforce that learning and to reinforce those structures. So what does this look like in terms of the grand transformation? When I started at that school, I remember asking my Spanish 4 students to write a story, an essay, I don't remember, and they could not. And I was shocked because this is Spanish 4. They should be able to do everything. They couldn't. But when I started to use comprehensible input and acquisition-driven instruction, my Spanish 1 students were outpacing that Spanish 4 class that I had taught the year before. It was a bit of a transition where all of my classes sort of started on that Spanish 1 level, and then I pushed them harder, and as we grew in levels, they got better and stronger. So those students who started with me in Spanish 1 got stronger as they moved into Spanish 2, and then they got even better as they moved into Spanish 3. But it took time and it took effort to get them there. And so I use a writing tracker, which you can get for free in my TPT. And students can track how many words they've written. And so during that first year, my Spanish 1s were already hitting 100 words by January. And at the end of the year, they were asking for more pages so they could add additional details to their stories, which is amazing. So the biggest takeaway that I have here is that it works, right? Teaching in Spanish works. Giving students those supports that they need to acquire Spanish, it works. And students can acquire more language easily and naturally, given the right balance of structure and language use. So if I could give you just 4 tips to get started, I would say start small with circling questions. You can Google circling questions. There's tons of information out there about it. Use visual inputs like graphics or clip chat, which used to be called movie talk. But just get those graphics in there and get those visuals so that students are making connection between vocabulary and what they can see. And then always follow whatever story you're doing, whatever input you're doing with some structure so that students have a little bit of practice and they can like get hands-on with those ideas that they've just acquired. And then the last tip that I have is to assess their progress, like check in, check for understanding. I know it's a buzzword, but check for understanding with activities, quizzes, whatever you need to do. And remember, like there's no one size fits all, but it's also not a free for all. It is structured just in a different way. And you've got to find what works best for you. So let me know if you have questions. You can leave them in the comments down below and I will follow up with you. Ciao, profe.